At the end of episode 3 of Andor, Syril Karn is inconsolable. He's had his first taste of combat and utterly failed. He's witnessed men underneath his command get blown up by a bomb-laden speeder. He's been tied up and outsmarted by a fugitive, and now he's in shock and unable to move or speak. What's going on in his head here? Is he furious that Andor has gotten away? Is he lamenting the loss of the corpos who have died during this operation? Or have his nerves just been overwhelmed with fear and adrenaline? In the next episode, we find out that the Deputy Inspector's career is more or less over. Not only that, the Empire will be taking over all operations on Morlana 1 because of Karn's unsanctioned and disastrous mission on Ferrix. When ISB Supervisor Blevin berates the corpos, the Deputy Inspector remains silent. He's the only one who doesn't offer any resistance or excuses for his actions. As a matter of fact, the first time we hear him utter a word after the Battle of Ferrix is when he finally arrives at home on Coruscant and greets his mother. In today's video, I want to take a look at what exactly is going on with Deputy Inspector Syril Karn. He's clearly an important character. He was introduced in the first arc of the show as more or less the main bad guy. He's clearly an important character. He was introduced in the first arc of episodes as more or less the main bad guy in that part of the series. The type of exposure and attention he's been given means that his story is long from over, although clearly his career has ended before the show has even kicked off into high gear. So where will he go next? Which side of the war will he join? Because remember his words.
There comes a time when the risk of doing nothing becomes the greatest risk of all.
Those are not the words of someone who will go quietly into the night and fade away from the story. The first time we see Deputy Inspector Syril Karn is in Chief Inspector Hines' office. He had stayed up an entire night putting together reports about the recent murder of 2 corpo sentries on Morlana 1. He's a stiff-postured young lad, and the audience clearly is supposed to think that he's a bit ridiculous for modifying his uniform to make himself look a bit more aggressive and combat-ready.
Have you modified your uniform?
But let's take a step back from the scene for a second and forget everything we know about who Cassian Andor is. Forget all you know about Rogue One. Forget even why Andor has to end up killing those 2 guards who clearly were looking for trouble, because Syril Karn also has no idea what's really happened here. He's simply a deputy inspector who's extremely moved by the death of his colleagues. And he's eager to do his job. I would say he's gone above and beyond the call of duty by working overtime. The audience is supposed to side with Chief Inspector Hines here, who can hardly be bothered by what he calls a
tough case.
It's tough for him because the Empire is sort of breathing down his neck, and the Corporate Sector Authority Chief Inspector doesn't want them to know that things are getting a bit out of control in his sector. I would argue that Chief Inspector Hines is clearly a part of the problem on this planet. His idea of policing is underreporting crime and sweeping difficult cases beneath the rug. Even if the Corporate Sector Authority is considered a villainous organization, the lack of care he has for the death of his men beneath his command makes him at best an incompetent officer, and a heartless one at that. Syril Karn, after a moment of hesitation, decides to take matters into his own hands. He pressures a colleague into scanning the recent air traffic space to see if they can detect any anomalies that might lead them to the murder suspect. The deputy inspector might seem a bit demanding here.
You'd have to filter the entire night.
Well, it's too much for you, let me know. I'm sure somebody wants the chair.
There clearly is a discipline issue here at this security force, and as Syril Karn attempts to use the resources of the station to find Cassian, he encounters resistance and annoyance, a product of the culture created by Chief Inspector Hines. One might say that Syril Karn is quite imperial in his posture and adherence to rules and regulations. They might say that he's a bit too demanding and even authoritarian. But I would argue there's something that separates Syril Karn from the typical imperial officer, and that is ambition and the pursuit of power. Ask anyone who survived the ruthless Imperial Academy system. Every Imperial is always looking to climb up the command ladder, usually at the expense of their colleagues. Syril Karn actually remains quite respectful of Chief Inspector Hines, despite the fact that he's quite incompetent. Sure, Syril Karn disobeys a direct order to stand down, but at no time does Syril Karn try to report Chief Inspector Hines for trying to cover up the murder of a colleague. Something that he could have easily done, and he most likely would have gotten a promotion as a result. Syril Karn is fanatic in his pursuit of Cassian Andor because he truly wants justice for the 2 recently murdered officers. Take a look at the dynamics between the Imperial Security Bureau supervisors, on the other hand. When Deidre Miro asked for information about the appearance of a stolen Starpath unit on Ferrix, Supervisor Blevin, who watches over that territory, refuses to give her the information. He's worried that Deidre is trying to take over his territory and gain more power. When that clearly wasn't the case, this kind of political infighting is classic Imperial nonsense and why the organization quickly collapsed after the death of Emperor Palpatine. Syril Karn is anything but that. Sure, he's naive and perhaps a bit too fond of law and order, but that in itself does not make him a bad person or even a proper Imperial. Syril Karn is in the beginning of his journey in life. When you're young and foolish, before the terrible weight of the world and the actions of other desperate and terrified men scar each other through conflict and cruelty. What happens next for Syril Karn? If he was so moved by the death of 2 sentry guards he's only met through files, how will he feel now that Andor and another unknown assailant has killed 4 security officers directly beneath his command? And so, is this boiling rage we see in him? Or is it the devastation one feels when their actions lead men to their deaths? It's easy to have lofty ideals and claim to care about the men you serve with from the safety of the administration office on Morlana 1. But how do Syril Karn's ideals hold up on the battlefield of Ferrix? Many of you who are watching this, who have never been tested but have often thought about such things, have asked yourselves the same question before. In all honesty, Syril Karn was quick to crumble when Cassian Andor pointed a blaster at the back of his head. He gave up how many soldiers were deployed with him quickly, for sure, but that alone doesn't label him a coward necessarily, or one who shirks away from duty. The story of Syril Karn's ambush actually reminds me of the story of another young Imperial, idealistic and fresh from the Royal Imperial Academy. I'm talking about ISB officer Alexander Kallus. He'd been deployed on Onderon with a platoon of stormtroopers. They were ambushed by a Lasat mercenary allied with Saw Gerrera. He witnessed all of his men get killed in an ambush, and several of his injured men were executed later on. Kallus hardened after that experience. He sought revenge. He committed great atrocities and massacred the Lasat species on their homeworld. But ultimately, in a twisted way, Kallus was never completely evil. He was just another spawn of the cruelties of war. It took the kindness of another Lasat who saved his life many years later to open his eyes to what the Empire was: a terribly backwards, inefficient, cruel, and unjust organization. There's a reason why good oftentimes prevails over evil. Mon Mothma understood this better than anyone. When an organization cares for its members and holds itself up to high moral standards, it's not just an ideological move, it's a logical move that creates more efficiency and trust amongst the members of that organization. There's much less micromanaging, and therefore more motivation and freedom at the individual level to do the right thing. People like Syril Karn and Alexander Kallus, people like Wedge Antilles, Iden Versio were on the wrong side of the war at the beginning because of a wide range of circumstances in their lives that were way outside of their control. But these were quality people, and what separated them from their Imperial colleagues was their own strong internal moral compass, which ultimately became incompatible. Now, Syril Karn technically was never a part of the Empire. The corporate security on Morlana 1 are a separate entity, in name at least. Think of them as more like a planetary defense force. But now that he's removed from the organization, essentially free, it'll be extremely interesting to see what his next move will be, because this won't be the last we hear of him. The actions of the people on Ferrix also won't go unpunished. Syril Karn has some unfinished business, and the way I see it, is a 50-50 chance of joining either side of the fight. And that's because individuals like him have an ego that allows them to convince themselves that they have what it takes to make a difference in the world. Where others might think themselves powerless in a greater galactic struggle, individuals like Syril Karn believe that there comes a time when the risk of doing nothing becomes the greatest risk of all.